Good morning, people of grace. I hope that you are able to enjoy this Lord's Day wherever you are sheltering together. And for this Lord's Day, I want to begin to have us pivot back to the book of Ephesians, which was the book we were in right before this pandemic and shutdown hit. And the last thing we covered in the book of Ephesians was submit to one another out of reverence for Christ from Ephesians 5:21. And that idea of submission in our souls has been the major theme, if you've noticed it, of these talks that I've had since the shutdown happened, mainly on my Sunday discussions, but even in my Pastoral Connects on Thursday. So I want to talk about that for a minute as we talk about submission and the soul and what is that. In these last few weeks, I've talked a lot about the soul and that our soul or our self or our awareness, uh, biblically speaking, has kind of three parts to it. And this is actually supported by modern science too, but there is the fearing part, what we might call gut level awareness. There is the delighting part, which is more our affections and our heart awareness. And then there's the analyzing part, which is what we think of as cognitive or conscious, and the part that we tend to be most consciously aware of and therefore value the most. All three of them have different roles, and a healthy soul integrates all three of them because the soul is you. And you have this awareness that's related to this world, that's our body, but according to scripture is also related to the unseen world, the heavenly realm, and that's our spiritual focus. So we are always fearing, delighting, analyzing, and we're often very aware of what's coming in from the world, or at least somewhat aware of it, and even from our own bodies. But then there's this other part that's unseen. And in Ephesians, that's actually that unseen part is where the problem really came from because one being did not submit in his soul. And it created all this tumult and chaos. And it originates in that unseen realm, but it bleeds into our world that we can see. And all of our souls are caught up in that. And part of reestablishing our spiritual foundation, healing that spiritual foundation so that our soul can be healed, is to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ and really imitate his submission in our awareness, our soul. So, with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Psalm 62. And Psalm 62, verses 1 through 8, is your scripture reading for today. So, I'm not going to read that right now, but hopefully you can follow along or have read that before this message. So, David in this psalm talks about the need for his soul to wait in silence for God. And the Hebrew people's idea of silence was submission. It didn't necessarily mean that you didn't talk at all, but it dealt with this deeper, what I would call a subcognitive place where you are well ordered, where you're at peace. And for the Hebrew people, the ocean was often a picture of this. The throne of God in their vision is just pictured as a sea of glass leading up to the throne, a very calm sea. And a very tumultuous sea is Leviathan rising and chaos coming up. And that's disorder. Leviathan's ultimately a picture of Satan. So a silent soul can speak, and speaking is a verbal and an analytical act, but a silent soul doesn't need to speak. It's coming from a different place of calmness and being well ordered. And that's how David starts this psalm, saying, as he's stressed and he's challenged, that for God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. That idea of shaken, the book of Hebrews really kind of nails that point when it says that those who are connected to God have an anchor for their soul and they're just really waiting for everything that can be shaken to be shaken and removed, so only what is unshakable remains. And what is unshakable is that which has that anchor going into the very presence of God, the holy place. And David is in a place in his life where he's full of anxiety and grief and sorrow and stress. And he is realizing, whoa, I need to wait. And ultimately, only God can resolve this. So I need to wait on him. And that transitions us to verses 3 and 4, um, talking about how we all get battered by life. And in David's case, it was people. But the bigger picture in Psalms is whenever you feel stressed or challenged. For the Psalms and for the Hebrew wisdom literature in general, true confidence comes out of working through what they would call lament or grief or sorrow. And the short point of that is if we don't grieve well, if we don't sorrow well, if we don't process the hard things well, then we lose our confidence in the Lord and in walking with the Lord. And then you aren't perceiving that anchor for the soul. It's not part of your awareness. And David is realizing he needs to get back to that. The Hebrew wisdom literature, out of the whole Hebrew Bible, especially the wisdom literature and some of the prophetic writings, really hammer on this point of you have to process through these grievous things well to have confidence and therefore true joy. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 7, I included a slide for you in the email, when we preached through Ecclesiastes 7, what I called 8 steps to effective agency. And the first 3 are that we have to frame good and evil biblically. We have to put character first, and we have to learn from evil emotions. Ecclesiastes 7, 1 through 4 talks about how a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. Sorrow is better than laughter. But then here's the turning point. For by sadness the heart is made glad. When you are patient and you process through the grief, and you wait on the Lord, you bring your soul into this ordered place and just wait on the Lord, then you get to a place of joy. And that's my hope for all of us as we go through this COVID-19 pandemic, is that as we come out of it and our whole culture is starting to talk about re-engaging, and there'll be all kinds of political fights about the best way to do that, and a lot of that is born out of souls that are not in this well-ordered place. They're not waiting in a healthy way. They're full of fear and anxiety in a bad way, full of fear, and it's driving a lot of their analysis and their decision making. And as Christians, we need to make sure that we don't sink into that. And we all struggle with it, and David was struggling with it when he wrote this psalm. But David recognized, I've got to process all that grief well. And Solomon, his son, did too. Because when Solomon is saying the day of death is better than the day of birth, he's not being hyper literal. The key in this Hebrew poetry, and I don't want to get hung up on taking a lot of time to unpack Hebrew poetry, but the key is really in that first statement. A good name is better than precious ointment. So, and the day of death better than the day of birth. That's a parallel thought in a way that the second one helps explain the first, and the first helps explains the second, because the day of birth represents your potential. And the day of death reveals your name, your character. And so good times feel like times with a lot of potential, and bad times feel like death. But good times don't reveal your character. Your unwillingness to process bad times and wait on the Lord reveals your name. And that's really what this whole life is about, is when this life is over, what will your name be? And ultimately, whose name will have risen above all? And the biblical answer, of course, is not David, who was an anointed one of the Lord, but the anointed one of the Lord, Christ. And his death reveals his name, his character. And it reveals ours too. But we have to be willing to grieve. And you see that in Psalm 62, because David is in this place where he's being attacked by a lot of people, sometimes physically, but with their words and in their hearts, they were hostile to him. And that's one trial that David often faced, and he faced other trials that were more direct physical threats, like being hunted by King Saul or facing Goliath. But in all of these trials and these griefs, David came up with 4 big points. Number 1, patience or long suffering is the key. Number 2, don't let the between time from when you felt like you were in a good place to now you're really anxious and striving and hindered and persecuted, as David was in Psalm 62. And now you have to just wait. There's nothing you can do to change it. And David recognizes that his soul's at risk, that his inheritance could be stolen in that time. So he says, don't let that happen. But number 3, recognize when you're wavering. So patience is the key. Don't let the between times steal your inheritance. Recognize when you are wavering and then lean into the community of God. Those are 4 big points from Psalm 62, verses 1 through 8. I've already looked at verses 1 and 2. Verses 3 and 4 say, how long will all of you attack a man, to batter him? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. Now, we're in this pandemic, and we're in an incredibly politically volatile time. Don't read too much of that into these verses that David was writing. We need to learn from these verses. But sometimes we react to Bible verses based on our context, when really the Bible verses are supposed to inform our context. But what you see in this time is the between time, where David is feeling attacked and torn down and in danger of losing his high position. And here's the kind of insight from that. All of us humans have been given an incredibly high position. And some before Christ achieved that in more obvious ways, like David, and others did not. But if you went further in this psalm that we're going to go today, David isn't really saying to get caught up in that. Whether you have a high visible position or a low visible position is really kind of a vapor. All that passes away. Death comes to the powerful and to the weak. Death comes to the oppressors and the oppressed. Death comes to the rich and the poor. But David had achieved a more visibly high position, and he recognized that a lot of what life is trying to do from us is just take that away from humans, to make humans just be another animal. I think animals are amazing. I love animals. To make humans lose their sense of high calling. David is the one who says, what are humans that you're so mindful of us, that you've set us above all these things? And life can take that away from you. And ultimately, as we transition back to Ephesians, what we see by the time we get to really to the end of the Old Testament, and especially in the New Testament, is that all of these human things or pandemics, wars and rumors of wars, famines and pestilence and plagues and pandemics, poverty, antichrist, all these different things aren't really the enemy. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood or physical events. It's a struggle for our spirit. And ultimately, the one driving that attack is a liar and is trying to take us from our high position. And so in that, David says, patience or long suffering is the key. And then he mentions these other things. He starts with, for God alone, my soul waits in silence. That's verse 1. I've already covered that. So waits, that's patience. In silence, that's submission, that's well ordered. As you're feeling battered and as life comes at you, it's trying to steal your high position, your inheritance, which is actually, your inheritance is simply who God created you to be. It's who you ultimately are, in his eyes, created, redeemed through Christ, and then sealed and secured by the presence of the Holy Spirit. And life will take that from you. It will take that inheritance from you. And then you become like a leaning wall, a tottering fence. And as David is stuck in this between time of when he felt well grounded and now he doesn't, and he has no idea of how long this is going to last, he just has to wait. He said he returns back to God. But the way he says it again in verses 5 through 7 is David was in a good place, verses 1 and 2. Now he's wavering and tottering, and he's starting to get worked up again. And he says, okay, come, wait in silence, hope in him. He is the source of salvation. I can't make that happen. I have to wait on that. And those are those 4 big points again is patience, silence or submission inwardly, hope in the Lord, and then not shaken. Patience becomes the big one. For the Hebrew people, they were often oppressed and conquered and lost their land and returned to it. And even by the time we get to our New Testament, they're in the land, they're an occupied country. And the Christians take that theme because they get kicked even out of the synagogues, and now they have no territory, and they really push patience and the importance of patience or long suffering, the ability to wait. For the Christians, that was a cardinal virtue. And for the world that they were in, it was not a cardinal virtue. It was recognized as a virtue, but it wasn't being shrewd or prudent. It wasn't being courageous. It wasn't being just. It wasn't being temperate in the sense of calm. And it was just waiting in the face of long suffering. But the Christians had realized that it's God's patience, as he's waiting as well, that is actually what makes God seem so weak, makes it seem like God doesn't care, and makes it seem like you're going to lose it. And the Christians learned to lean into that, and it was actually the long suffering and patience of the Christians that blew the Romans' minds. They didn't get it because it didn't make sense to them. And there was a virtue the Christians demonstrated, and David is saying this in 950 or 1000 AD, that I need to be patient, I need to be long suffering, I need to wait on God. And that will allow my soul to be ordered and for me to keep hope and not be shaken. And so David kind of talks himself back from that anxious place where he's getting worked up and returns to the community of God. And that's how he ends this section, talking about, on God rests my salvation and my glory, my high position, the restoration of my being. And then he comes back to the community and says, trust him, people. Trust in this context is wait on him. Be long suffering, but while you're suffering, pour out your heart before him. And that's where David turns back to his community and becomes a source of encouragement to them and challenging them to keep the patience and waiting and stay in a well-ordered place while you wait. There's no secret to that. We talk ourselves down from the cliff of anxiety and fear and impatience, or we don't. And if we don't, then we lose our soul. I'm not talking about when you leave this world. I'm talking about the day in, day out battle for your soul. Because remember, we're coming back around to Ephesians. And the book of Ephesians ends with the need to win that fight for your soul. And that's fought against spiritual forces of wickedness in the unseen realms, the heavenly realms. And a patient soul, a submissive, silent soul, is a soul that through the grief discovers hope and is not shaken. David walks us through that in this psalm, There's other Psalms where David's back in the shaking place. He's just like us, right? But you can talk yourself through this not by any other thing than saying, I just need to be silent in my soul and wait and practice that long suffering. I would really challenge you to do that. It is really, for many of us, the turning point in the battle to maintain our spiritual orientation, to win the battle for our souls. It was David's turning point in Psalm 62. And it was really the turning point in the Christians ultimately becoming a great source of hope in the Roman Empire as they continued to grow even while being persecuted. They were long suffering. They waited on the Lord. And because they did, they made a huge difference in their world. And you can too in our world during a pandemic time. I look forward to coming back to Ephesians next week with you and working through as our church community as the governor allows it and the prohibitions get lessened, coming back into a more visible community as the Lord leads us. Pray that your church council would have wisdom at that point and have a blessed Lord's Day. Bye.